Brucolleri joins us now. Morning to you.
Thanks.
This is great. It's a real take on a story that we know so well, but from a completely different perspective.
Yeah.
Maybe just explain for people who haven't had a chance to catch up.
So this is it's the familiar world of Pride and Prejudice. Slightly different to how people know it because it's all through Mary Bennet's perspective. So I think people who are expecting the same versions of those characters, they're slightly different because it's through the prism of Mary's eyes. And Mary Bennet, she's kind of the forgotten middle child in a way. She doesn't quite fit in or even understand the societal norms of Regency England, and it's about her kind of trying to find herself, stepping away from her family and trying to discover who she really is, I suppose.
And there's a lot of rules and regs in society
So
back then,
many.
isn't there?
Yeah,
Especially
so
for
many.
the ladies.
Yes, and I had a movement coach, a wonderful Lucy Pankhurst, who taught me all those rules.
Really?
And then I got to kind of break a lot of them because I think Mary doesn't understand them, so
She was never meant to stand out, never meant to be remembered, and yet this time, Mary Bennet might be the most powerful voice in Jane Austen's world, and what Ella Bruccoleri reveals about playing her changes everything you thought you knew. There's something quietly unsettling about stepping into a world where you already know the rules, a world shaped by expectations, tradition, and unspoken judgments, where every glance, every word, every gesture carries meaning. And in that world, Mary Bennet has always been the one who fades into the background, the one people overlook, the one whose presence is acknowledged but rarely understood. And that is exactly where Ella Bruccoleri begins her journey, not as the center of attention, but as the observer of a society that never quite made space for her. And what makes this portrayal so different, so unexpectedly compelling, is the way it refuses to rush her transformation, instead allowing us to sit with her discomfort, her silence, her quiet confusion as she tries to make sense of a world that seems to reward everything she is not. Because unlike the heroines audiences are used to, Mary does not enter the room with confidence or charm. She does not captivate with wit or beauty, and she certainly does not fit into the polished image that defines women in Pride and Prejudice. And yet, that is precisely what makes her story feel so real. Because through Ella's interpretation, Mary becomes more than just a character. She becomes a reflection of anyone who has ever felt out of place, anyone who has ever questioned their worth in a world that seems to measure value by appearance and social grace. And as Ella herself explains in her insight, playing Mary was not about changing her into something she is not, but about understanding the depth of her inner world, the constant tension between who she is and who society expects her to be. And that tension is where the story begins to breathe, because instead of forcing Mary into the mold of a traditional heroine, this version leans into her discomfort, her awkwardness, even her silence, and turns those qualities into something meaningful, something powerful, something that slowly begins to challenge the very system that once diminished her. And what's even more striking is how this shift in perspective changes the entire tone of the story, because suddenly the familiar world of ballrooms and polite conversations starts to feel different, almost fragile, as if beneath its elegance lies a quiet pressure that has gone unnoticed for far too long. And Mary, in her stillness, begins to expose it, not through rebellion or dramatic gestures, but through something far more subtle, her refusal to fully conform, her quiet resistance to becoming what others expect. And it is in these moments that Ella brings a new layer to the character, revealing not just Mary's insecurities, but also her strength, a strength that does not demand attention, but exists nonetheless, waiting to be seen. And as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that Mary's journey is not about suddenly becoming confident or admired, but about something deeper, something more honest, the slow, often painful process of understanding herself in a world that has never truly listened. And that raises a question that lingers long after the moment passes. If Mary Bennet was never meant to stand out, then why does her story now feel like the one we can't ignore? As the story moves forward, something begins to shift, but not in the way you might expect, because this is not a sudden transformation, not a dramatic moment where Mary Bennet suddenly becomes confident or admired. Instead, it is slower, quieter, almost invisible at first. And that is what makes Ella Bruccoleri's portrayal feel so deeply real, because she leans into the discomfort rather than escaping it. She allows Mary to remain uncertain, to hesitate, to question herself, even in moments where others seem completely sure of who they are. And in doing so, she reveals something that is often ignored in stories like Pride and Prejudice: the emotional weight of being the one who doesn't fit the pattern, the one who watches from the edges while everyone else seems to belong so effortlessly. And what makes this even more powerful is how the people around Mary begin to influence her without even realizing it. Because while society as a whole continues to value charm, beauty, and social success, there are small, almost unnoticed moments of kindness that begin to break through that rigid structure. Moments where Mary is not judged, not corrected, not compared, but simply accepted. And those moments, as simple as they seem, start to reshape the way she sees herself. Because for the first time, she is not trying to become someone else. She is starting to understand that she doesn't have to. And Ella captures this internal shift with incredible subtlety, showing how even the smallest changes in environment can create a ripple effect within someone who has spent so long feeling invisible. And suddenly, Mary's silence no longer feels like weakness. Her awkwardness no longer feels like failure. Instead, they begin to take on a new meaning, becoming part of her identity rather than something she needs to hide. And this is where the story quietly challenges everything the audience expects, because instead of building toward a grand moment of validation from society, it focuses on something far more personal: the idea that self-worth does not come from being chosen or admired, but from being understood. And as Mary slowly starts to experience that understanding, even in small ways, it begins to change how she carries herself. Not dramatically, not in a way that demands attention, but in a way that feels honest, grounded, and deeply human. And through Ella's performance, we start to see a version of Mary that has always been there but was never given the space to exist. A version that is thoughtful, perceptive, and quietly strong. And yet, despite this growing sense of self, the world around her does not suddenly become kinder or more accepting. The expectations are still there, the comparisons still linger, and the pressure to conform has not disappeared, which creates a tension that continues to build beneath the surface. Because now the question is no longer just about how Mary sees herself, but about how long she can hold on to that sense of identity in a world that constantly tries to reshape it. And as this tension deepens, one thing becomes increasingly clear. If being accepted can change someone's world, then what happens when that acceptance is taken away? And just when it begins to feel like Mary Bennet has found something steady, something she can quietly hold on to, the world around her starts to press in again, not loudly, not suddenly, but in the same subtle, persistent way it always has, reminding her of the expectations she can never fully escape. And this is where Ella Bruccoleri brings an even deeper layer to the role, because instead of showing Mary as someone who has overcome her struggles, she shows us someone who is still in the middle of them, still navigating the tension between who she is becoming and who she is expected to be. And that tension begins to reveal something far more complex about the society shaped by Jane Austen's world. Because beneath the elegance and politeness, there is an unspoken pressure that never truly fades. A pressure that quietly asks Mary to adjust herself, to soften her edges, to become more agreeable, more presentable, more like the version of a woman that society finds acceptable. And what makes this so powerful is that Mary is now aware of it in a way she wasn't before. She can see the expectations clearly. She understands how they work. And yet, that awareness does not make it easier to resist them. In fact, it makes the conflict even more intense, because now every choice feels heavier, every moment of silence feels deliberate, and every attempt to fit in feels like a compromise she is no longer sure she wants to make. And Ella captures this internal struggle with a quiet intensity, allowing us to feel the weight of every unspoken thought, every hesitation, every moment where Mary is caught between staying true to herself and giving in to the world around her. And as these moments begin to build, something else starts to emerge, an unexpected strength, not the kind that announces itself or demands recognition, but the kind that grows slowly, almost unnoticed, until it becomes impossible to ignore. And this strength does not come from rebellion or defiance. It comes from understanding, from the realization that she does not have to measure her worth by standards that were never made for her in the first place. And yet, even as this realization takes hold, the question remains: can that quiet strength survive in a world that continues to reward everything she is not? Or will it be tested in ways she is not prepared for? Because as Mary stands at this fragile turning point, one truth becomes impossible to avoid. What happens when the person you are becoming no longer fits the life you've been given? By now, the shift inside Mary Bennet is no longer something hidden beneath the surface. It is there, present in the way she listens, the way she pauses before speaking, the way she no longer rushes to adjust herself to meet expectations that once defined her. And yet, the world around her has not changed. The rules are still the same. The judgments still linger in quiet glances and carefully chosen words. And this is where Ella Bruccoleri takes the performance into its most delicate and revealing phase. Because instead of giving Mary a moment of clear victory, she places her in situations where her growth is tested in the most subtle but painful ways, where acceptance is no longer guaranteed, and where the comfort she once began to feel starts to slip, not completely, but just enough to remind her how fragile it really is. And this creates a powerful contrast, because now Mary is no longer unaware. She cannot go back to simply accepting her place without question. She sees the limitations. She feels the pressure, and most importantly, she understands what it costs to ignore her own identity. And that understanding begins to change how she responds to the world, not with dramatic defiance, but with quiet decisions, small moments where she chooses honesty over approval, even when it risks isolation, even when it leaves her standing alone in a room that once defined her entire sense of belonging. And it is in these moments that the story becomes something far more intense than a simple character journey. It becomes a reflection of something deeply human: the fear of losing acceptance, the fear of being misunderstood, and the even greater fear of losing yourself in the process of trying to belong. And through Ella's portrayal, we begin to see that Mary's silence is no longer the same silence we saw at the beginning. It is no longer filled with uncertainty or confusion. It is filled with awareness, with choice, with a kind of quiet courage that does not need recognition to exist. And yet that courage comes at a cost, because the more Mary holds on to who she truly is, the more she risks stepping outside the world that once gave her structure. And this is where the tension reaches its most fragile point, because everything now depends on whether that inner strength is enough to carry her forward, or whether the weight of expectation will slowly pull her back into the version of herself she has been trying to outgrow. And as this internal conflict reaches its peak, one question begins to echo louder than ever. Is becoming your true self worth the risk of losing everything that once made you feel safe? And this is where everything comes together, not in a loud, dramatic resolution, but in something far more powerful, far more lasting, because Mary Bennet's journey was never about changing the world around her. It was about understanding her place within it. And by the time we reach this final stretch, that understanding feels earned, shaped by every quiet moment, every hesitation, every internal battle that Ella Bruccoleri has allowed us to witness with such careful precision. precision. And what makes this conclusion so different from what audiences might expect from a story rooted in the world of Jane Austen is that it does not rely on validation from others to define Mary's worth. It does not need a grand declaration or a sudden shift in how society sees her. Instead, it focuses on something much more intimate, the way Mary begins to see herself. And that shift, though quiet, carries more weight than any external approval ever could, because for the first time, she is no longer measuring her value against standards that never truly understood her. She is no longer trying to reshape herself into something more acceptable, more admired, more easily loved. Instead, she stands in that same world, surrounded by the same expectations, but with a different sense of self, one that is grounded not in comparison, but in awareness. And that awareness changes everything, even if the world does not immediately reflect it back to her. And that is what makes this portrayal linger long after the story ends, because it does not offer a perfect resolution. It offers something more honest, something that feels closer to real life, where growth is not always visible to others, where change does not always come with recognition, but still matters deeply. And through Ella's performance, Mary becomes a reminder that strength does not always look the way we expect it to. It is not always loud or confident or easily understood. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is uncertain. Sometimes it exists in the simple act of choosing not to disappear. And as the story gently reaches its end, there is a lingering feeling that Mary's journey is not truly over, that this is only the beginning of a life lived with a clearer sense of self, a life where she may still face the same world, but no longer from the same place within it. And that leaves us with a final, unsettling thought. If the world never changes the way it sees you, but you finally change the way you see yourself, which one truly defines who you become?